In this video, I'm going to show you how to deal with data that your deluge serverless function might send to an external API. As an example here, this is a function within Smooth Messenger that syncs messages from the CRM to our Python backend. We'll have a look at the code here, and then I'll show you the Python afterwards. We've got the endpoint URL, which is a standard format for a Flask app. We're specifying the headers. We have then the invoke URL section where we are sending out the data. The key thing to note here is that we're doing a post, and for parameters, that's where we're specifying the payload that is going to be sent to that endpoint. It's basically going to be a JSON array, which will, I can't give you an exact example, but it will look something a bit like this. So we've basically got an array of objects here. If we had two messages, a better example might be, this is what it might look like. We would be sending here an array, and inside the array we've got several objects. We've got an object containing message, SID, and message. And then on the other end, here's what the Flask endpoint looks like. We're accepting a post. We then use json.loads to turn the string, because it will be basically text that is sent over the API, and then we convert that into, by using json.loads, we convert it into a list of dictionaries in Python. And then once we have that, it's pretty easy. In our case, we're not processing it immediately, we're using a background queue to process it in the background. But basically, if you're familiar with Python, I think there was a question in the YouTube comments about what the actual structure of it, where Morton Rock here was talking about wanting to know how to get your head around it in PHP. I think the key thing is that you'd want to have a data structure like this, where it's generally an array of records, or if you're only sending one record at a time, it would be like this. And then in PHP, that would be turned into an associative array. In Python, that would get turned into a dictionary. In JavaScript, that gets parsed as an object. And then using your knowledge of any of those programming languages at the other end, you should be able to then work with the data. There's no real difference between what we're doing here in the deluge script with invoke URL compared to if I pull up Insomnia and I send some data to a different API and I choose a JSON payload to send. Example here. This basically does the same job, where we're sending some JSON over the wire. In this case, it's going to a deluge endpoint, but it's the same as if I come in here and here's an endpoint where we're registering a user, for example. And in this case, we're specifying the URL, we're specifying the payload, and then the code on the other end is able to parse that. There's no real difference between, if I can do the exact same thing in the deluge script. I can say something like this. That's the same as what I'm doing here in Insomnia, where we're sending it over the wire in JSON format. And the only thing here with JSON, the only difference between that and doing plain is that the headers are different. If I choose plain, then the content type is text/plain, whereas if I choose JSON, the content type is application/JSON, and that's what we're doing up here. So hopefully that helps. I think if you're pretty proficient with PHP or Python or .NET, Node.js, it shouldn't be a real problem to be able to handle the request on the other side. But maybe those tips around what the data structure might look like could be helpful.